Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DeCosta, and thank you for joining me today. It's been a little while since I last produced an audio, but I am going to pump one out tonight as I am here in Alabama on the Gulf Shores, and I am here for a small meeting. And I was actually out on the beach today enjoying some rays for about 20 minutes, and then all of a sudden God opened up the floodgates, and I saw Noah kind of floating in the abyss because it literally started hammering down cats and dogs. So I had to scoop up all my towels and all of my beach equipment, and I had to run to the vehicular. And from there, I went to a restaurant and ate myself some garlic and Parmesan char-grilled oysters, which were heavenly, and I washed it down with a couple of Yingling drafts, which were on happy hour for $1.50 each. So needless to say, it's been a blessed evening. Today I'm going to be doing a little teaching on comparing Romans chapter 1, which is a place of utmost confusion for most people, and I'm going to compare that to Acts chapter 7. And I've mentioned this before in other videos and in passing, but I don't think many people probably didn't pick up on it. I don't believe I did a video specifically dedicated to it, so I wanted to do this because it's quite eye-opening when you see it. So obviously I've been saying for a long time that Romans was written to the elect Israelites, the dispersed, gentilized Israelites living in that part of Rome, or living in Rome, I should say. The elect saints in that region. Now, obviously, there were Jews as well, because Paul often writes to both of them in the letter, comparing, or asking them, hey, what advantage do we have over our brethren that are not Jews, and so on. So he's constantly comparing the two, the Israelite Jew and the Israelite Gentile, and he's going through that whole thing there. But in Romans 1, we have the declaration, or the portion, I should say, that speaks about God's wrath on unrighteousness. And this is really the place that most people go to try to insert all of humanity into the text. Excuse me. And so I'm going to read it, and I'm going to stop here and there, and then I'm going to go over to Acts chapter 7 and point a few things out. So in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, we read the following. It says, Paul is writing about the wickedness of these people that he's speaking of, the people in focus, whoever they were. He says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. So first and foremost, we have to take a look at that first portion there in this section where Paul is speaking about these men who are suppressing the truth, and God has actually shown the truth to them, and he has manifest himself to them, and he has revealed himself to them, but they have suppressed the truth in their unrighteousness. Now, if you allow the Bible to interpret the Bible, and if you don't lose sight of what's been laid out before this, okay, let's just assume you read through the Bible from the beginning in Genesis all the way up to here in Romans chapter 1. If you remembered everything that you read about Israel and their relationship with Yahweh throughout the Old Testament, then when you come to this portion in Romans chapter 1, you won't be fooled into thinking that this is about all humanity, okay? Because what do I mean by that? Well, all throughout the Old Testament, the picture is painted very, very nicely, I might add, that God only knew Israel, that God only dealt with Israel, that God only revealed himself to Israel, that God did not declare his laws and judgments to anyone other than Israel. You, Israel, alone of all the families of the earth have I known, said God through Amos the prophet in chapter 3, verse 1 and forward. Moses asked the people of Israel, what other great nation has the Lord their God so close to them as the Lord our God is to us? How he did all these magnificent things for us, and he cast out people before our eyes, and he destroyed the Egyptians before our eyes, and he brought us out of bondage, and so on and so forth. All these miraculous things that they supposedly saw were revealed to them by God, right? So there was really no shortage of the miraculous revelation of God to the people of Israel all throughout the story. So you have to remember this, and what you also have to remember are the clear declarations that God did not reveal himself to anyone other than Israel, right? So if God didn't reveal himself or manifest himself to any other people besides the covenant people Israel, whom he was in covenant with, then when you get to Romans 1 and you see Paul over here yapping about these unrighteous people who suppress the truth, because what may be known of God has been made known to them, and God has shown it to them, then who do you think they are? Well, let's keep on reading. In verse 20, he says, "For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened." So when you see the creation of the world here, and I got to pause for a minute and just give props to David King. David King is a buddy of mine. He's in the Facebook world. He's IO all the way. He's just a super cool dude. He's super nice, too. I mean, the kid doesn't have a mean bone in his body. And he's full IO, fully convinced. He reaches out to me all the time. Such a good kid. He actually even offers to buy me drinks. He wants to deposit money into an account for me so he can buy me a couple rounds of drinks for my efforts. I mean, that's just the type of kid he is. He's just a good kid. And I'm saying kid, and he's probably older than me for all I know. I don't know much about his personal life or his age, but he's just a good guy. And he actually sent me a audio that he did as a practice run. He did it on John 3:16, and he emailed it to me. And he said, "Hey, check this out." It was locked, so not everybody could see it. He sent it to a few of us to listen and to critique and to, let him know what he could do different on his audios and whatnot. And let me tell you, I listened to the full hour, and what a teaching. It was marvelous. In fact, it was so good, I even asked him if I could share it on my channel. But obviously he wanted to kind of clean it up a little bit, as it was just a practice run, and he had some sounds in there that he wanted to get rid of, and he's just kind of feeling out how the whole audio game works. So he asked that I wait until he shares it on Ryan Provost's channel, which should be soon, and then I'll go ahead and hopefully be able to share it to mine if I can figure out how to do that. I'm sure I could just record it. That shouldn't be that hard. But anyways, I mean, what a glorious teaching this guy put forth on the world, right, and who the world actually was. And I mean, I've been saying this for a long time. Many people have been saying this for a long time. The world in the New Testament has nothing to do with the globe, okay? It has nothing to do with the Asians. It has nothing to do with the Americans. It has nothing to do with the Indians who were living on the other side of the world at that time. It has nothing to do with them, okay? The world has to do with Old Covenant Israel, those under the law. That's the world that God so loved, all right? Like Paul says in Romans 3, I believe it's verse 16, somewhere in that area, he says, "The law says what it says to those who are under it, that all the world may become guilty before God." So Paul shows you clearly that the law says what it says exclusively to those who are under it, not to the whole world, because we already know that God didn't declare his laws to anyone but Israel. And then Paul says that all the world might become guilty before God. So the whole world is those under the law. Very clear. And only Israel had the law, so you can understand who the world is. Okay, he came to his own. That's for God so loved the world. Paul said in Galatians 4, he was born into the law to redeem those under the law. That's the world that God so loved. Okay, and Moses even said this at the beginning, as he looked at the people of Israel and told them that your God loves you and set you high above all peoples of the earth. So the world that God so loved was established right from the start, and that was Old Covenant Israel. All right, so when we see Paul say this, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, so that they are without excuse, we can understand that, again, who did God reveal himself to? Just look back at the details of the story, folks. It's not hard, okay? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that God was revealing himself to Israel. Okay, so the world that God revealed himself to was the Old Covenant world of Israel. And the reason why they were without excuse is because they saw these things, they had the revelation of God, and they still chose to act a fool. Okay, and to not abide by the covenant and obey the law and all this. And of course, we know there's no imputation of sin without the law. So that means that they, being under the law, had imputed sin. Therefore, they were guilty. And it just really makes sense. But then he goes on in verse 21. He says, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Well, we can see that all throughout the story, can't we? I mean, right from the beginning, as they're coming out of Egypt, they're worshiping the golden calf. They're foolish. They're darkened. They're worshiping false idols. And this just happens repeatedly throughout the story. Why do you think the Israelites got exiled and banished in the story? Why do you think they were scattered into the nations? This is all the story is about, is Israel's unfaithfulness to the covenant that they had with their God. So Paul is kind of outlining that entire history here in Romans chapter 1. And he goes on in verse 22, he says, professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. Well, the four-footed animals and creeping things obviously matches up to the golden calf, which we all know was part of the story of the Israelites. When they came out of Egypt, they set up the golden calf and they worshipped it. And God was pissed, and I think he burnt it down and made the Israelites drink the ashes or some ridiculous thing like that. So again, Paul is just referring back to the history. Okay, he's not speaking about mankind in general. Paul is speaking about his people, their history, and what took place in their history since the creation of the covenant world, since the giving of the law, if you will. And in verse 24, he says, therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies amongst themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Well, again, if you just go back to the books of Psalms and Joshua and all these books in the Old Testament, you can see everywhere that the Israelites were engaging in sexual behaviors with other people, with foreigners, taking wives that they shouldn't have. There's all sorts of references to sexual sin in Israel's history in the Old Testament. Again, nothing new here. Paul is just outlining. And if you've listened to my old Romans teaching, I get into Old Testament examples of each of these things where I break it down even further. So if you want that, you can go back and check that out. There's literally dozens of each sentence here that I can point to. Then verse 26, it says, now pay attention here, verse 26, okay? So Paul just gets done speaking about all the nasty, vile filth and stuff that these people had done. Then he goes and says, for this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. For even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise, also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for another. Men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. So now, he says, for this reason, God gave them up. All right, so let's just continue in Romans 1 and finish this out. And then we'll jump over to Acts 7. It says in verse 28 of Romans 1, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them up to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-minded. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgments of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. So look at what Paul says here again about these people that he's speaking of here, this world. He's saying, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them up to a debased mind. So you'd have to have knowledge of God first in order to not retain that knowledge in your mind, right? But the picture that the Bible paints is that only Israel knew their God. Okay, the other nations were sort of left in darkness. They didn't have the revelation of God. God gave that revelation to Israel. Okay, and it says that because they didn't retain him in their knowledge, he gave them over to a debased mind to do all these wicked works. And again, that's what we see all throughout the history, is God sort of giving the Israelites up to their perversion and their wickedness and their law corruption, and letting them go all the way off path until he judges them and crushes them, kills them, scatters them, whatever it was. Okay, but this was a constant back and forth in the scriptures. He judges them, he forgives them. He judges them, he protects them. He judges them, he brings them back. This is the entire story. So Paul's not building anything new here. He's referring back to their history. And then in the end he says, who, knowing the righteous judgments of God, that those who practice these things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. So again, who knew the righteous judgments of God? Well, Psalm 147, 19 and 20 says, he declares his laws to Jacob, his statutes and judgments to Israel. He has not done this with any nation. Statutes and judgments to Israel. And then it finishes off, it says, and as for his judgments, they have not known them. In other words, the other nations had not known his judgments. They didn't know about this because only the law was given to Israel. The statutes, the laws, the commandments, the judgments were given to Israel. So again here, he says in verse 32 of Romans 1, who, these people, knowing the righteous judgment of God. So whoever these ones were, they knew the righteous judgment of God. Now, if the Bible declares that God only gave his laws, statutes, and judgments to Israel, then who do you think Paul is speaking of here? He's not speaking of Egyptians. He's not speaking of Italians, okay? He's speaking of the Israelites. But now I want to jump over to Acts chapter 7, which is the purpose of this audio, really, to kind of compare that to what we just saw in those last few verses where Paul says, for this reason, God gave them up. He gave them up. Okay, to all these dirty things. He gave them up to a debased mind. He gave them up to vile passions. He gave them up to what is shameful. In other words, he just let them be. You know, he said, okay, that's what you want. That's what you get, you know, and you're going to pay the price. All right, but let's take a look here. All right, so in verse 37 of Acts chapter 7, I think this is still Stephen speaking, right? He's addressing the high priest. All right, and in verse 37 of Acts chapter 7, Stephen says this. He's speaking of Israel and their rebellion against God back in their history. Now remember, he just went through the entire history of their forefathers. He went from Abraham to Moses all the way down, and now he's still on Moses here in verse 37. So again, this is all about Israel's history. Stephen has never changed one bit. He has not deterred one iota off of Israel's history. And in the entirety of Acts chapter 7, go read it. It's all about Moses and the people here. In verse 37, Stephen says, this is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren, and him you shall hear. So couldn't be any more clear, could it? Stephen's telling them that God was going to raise up a prophet like him from their brethren, for them. Again, that's Israel. And then in verse 38, he says, this is he who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, the one who received the living oracles to give to us, whom our fathers would not obey, but rejected. Again, here's Stephen referring back to Israel's fathers and Israel's history in the time of Moses and the time of Mount Sinai and the fathers. And what does he say? He says, whom our fathers would not obey, but rejected. And in their hearts, they turned back to Egypt. So again, Paul in Romans 1 speaks of this wicked people who would not obey, okay, who would not listen, whose hearts were deceitfully wicked, who were given up to wickedness. Okay, and here's Stephen speaking of Moses and the fathers, talking about how their fathers would not obey Moses, but they rejected him. And in their hearts, they turned back to Egypt. And then in verse 40, he says, saying to Aaron, this is what the people said to Aaron, make us gods to go before us. As for this Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And they made a calf in those days, offered sacrifices to the idol, and rejoiced in the work of their own hands. Okay, so again, here's Paul speaking in Romans 1 about these people worshiping the creature rather than the creator and building idols and, you know, becoming darkened and foolish and worshiping false crap. And here's Stephen talking about Israel's history and the fathers saying, and they made a calf in those days, Remember, Paul's saying they worship four-footing beasts and creeping things. That's the calf. And he says, and offered sacrifices to the idol, and they rejoiced in the work of their own hands. And then take note of verse 42, because here's the kicker. Here's the little gem. Stephen says, then God turned, ready, and gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets. And then he quotes, he says, did you offer me slaughtered animals and sacrifices during 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You also took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, images which you made to worship, and I will carry you away to Babylon. So, exact match to what Paul says in Romans 1. You have Paul speaking of this people in history, how they disobeyed God, they rejected God, they had his revelation, they had his guidance, they had his protection, yet they chose in their hearts to not obey. They chose to reject. They chose to do their own thing and to worship idols and to reject the Creator and worship the creature. And they chose all these things. They made calves and they made four-footed beasts and they worshiped them. And it said, Paul says, so God gave them up to these debased acts and these idol worshipings, and he just, in other words, gave them up. And look what Stephen does here in Acts chapter 7. Same exact type of discourse, folks. Same exact type. He's going through the entirety of Israel's history in Acts chapter 7. He comes to verse 37 and forward. And there's a lot more in Acts 7 that I could say. I'll probably read a little bit more here, but the point is that he's speaking of, again, a group of people. He refers to them as Israel and the fathers and Moses, that time frame. And he says all the same things that Paul says in Romans 1. They were wicked, they were defiled, they worshipped idols, they turned against Moses, they did not obey him, they rejected him, they made a calf, they worshipped it, they worshipped idols, they sacrificed to idols. And so what did God do? He gave them up to worship these things, to commit these vile acts. Same exact thing, folks. So Paul doesn't say that it's Israel explicitly in that section. He does everywhere else. I mean, heck, he says in Romans chapter 9, he asks, is God merciful to the Gentiles? And he quotes 3 passages all about the children of Israel coming back from the nations. In Romans 11, he says, when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, all Israel will be saved. I mean, this is Israel, folks. But that particular portion in Romans 1, he doesn't say it explicitly. Obviously, we can deduct it because it's clear. All right, it's clear as day. But if we come over to Acts chapter 7, we see the same discourse with the same details, with the same people, with the same vile acts, with everything's the same. And it's all about Israel. It's all about the fathers. It's all about Moses. It's all about Israel's history. Same exact thing. Okay? Unless you're going to argue that Paul was speaking of all humanity worshiping a golden calf and turning their backs on God and, rejecting certain things and becoming wicked and choosing to, not acknowledge the manifestations that he made for them. Unless you want to say that that's all humanity, and here Stephen's just speaking of Israel, that would be asinine, right? They're obviously speaking of the same people, okay? And then in verse 44, we'll just continue in Acts 7. It says, our fathers had the tabernacle of witness in the wilderness as he appointed, instructing Moses to make it according to the pattern that he had seen, which our fathers, having received it in turn, also brought with Joshua into the land possessed by the heathen, whom God drove out before the face of our fathers until the days of David, who found favor before God and asked to find a dwelling for the God of Jacob. But Solomon built him a house. And then we'll go down a little bit to verse 51. He's speaking to Israel still. He says, you stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. You always resist the Holy Spirit as your fathers did, so do you. Again, still referring back to the fathers of Israel. Never deters from that. Then he says in verse 52, which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who foretold the coming of the just one, of whom you now have become the betrayers and murderers, who have received the law by the direction of angels and have not kept it. All right, so again, the whole point of this is that Romans chapter 1, Paul's discourse there, lines up perfectly with Stephen's discourse in Acts chapter 7. And we know with ironclad certainty that Acts chapter 7 is all about the history of Israel. Therefore, we can deduct that Paul's discourse in Romans chapter 1 is absolutely 100% all about Israel as well, which is why just 3 chapters later in Romans chapter 4, he starts it off saying, what did our father Abraham find according to the flesh? In other words, according to the law. And why in Romans chapter 2, just one verse later, Paul is building up to that final moment when their Savior would come for them and they would be judged according to works. That was the end, and it was at hand. So obviously we know who he's speaking about in the historical, build-up that he just got done doing in Romans 1 into Romans 2. So that's about all I got for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I am hopefully going to be on Derek Lambert's Myth Vision podcast very soon. He's been asking me to do it. I did reply to him a couple days ago. Still haven't heard back, but I am available this Sunday, and I'm hoping that he gets back to me and says, yeah, let's do this. I know he's got kids and a wife, and he's working now, so his schedule's kind of jam-packed. And obviously I can only do it in certain times because of, certain situations and, a lot of drama that could happen if I chose to do it anytime rather than being selective about when I do it, which I think is a smart choice. But so hopefully that happens and I can go on the Myth Vision podcast and give a rundown of the truth of Israel only. Nice, clean, crisp summary of the view, along with some other new information and tidbits that I'd like to throw in that I have jotted down with notes. So hopefully that'll be a good little chat with Derek. And, who knows? I mean, his audience is obviously big on myth. I'm open to the myth view. I'm certainly not opposed to it. I just will not go somewhere that doesn't make sense of the text, right? It has to work with what I know the text to be saying. If it's not built on the foundation of Israel only, okay, whether the book is fiction or nonfiction, if it's not built on the foundation of Israel only, then I'm not going to buy into it because I know what the book says. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I know what the book says, right? All fiction, all nonfiction stories have a story. They have a theme, they have a narrative, they have a focus, right? So this is no different. So that's where I'm going to leave it, folks. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like, leave me a comment, tell me to F off, whatever pleases you. And we'll be back another day, another time, another place, and another rhyme. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.